Gentlemen, welcome to 2D6 Friday, the only way for a self-respecting wargamer to start their weekend. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. 2D6 Friday, episode 25 is in the house, as the kids say these days. And it is quite a packed house already. I can see in the chat it's been flowing quite readily for the last hour or so. We have the likes of Mickey Jenver, Bazooka J Rambo in the chat. Kyle Poole, we've got Skeleton Flower, Dreddy just popped in. People talking about tea at the moment in the chat, so if you want to partake in the tea debate, whether tea is superior to coffee perhaps, then you should jump in there right now. But that's not going to be my main topic of discussion tonight, unfortunately, for those of you that enjoy discussing heated beverages long into the night. Oh, there's Legion of One just popped into the chat as well. So, as you could tell by that beautiful thumbnail, the main topic of discussion tonight is going to be the Clash of Kings book for Kings of War and how it impacts my armies, which are, of course, goblins and undead, and then any other insights I have perhaps on any other armies from my vast Kings of War playing experience, how it might affect the armies that I've come up against in the past. There's Guy Harper in the chat as well, and he's asking some questions about what my tournament army is going to look like with this new book. Well, we're going to delve into that very shortly, and we've got a few other topics as well that we're going to touch on later on. Some people asked questions on Facebook in various different places, most of them in the Andy2D6 Orange Wargaming Facebook group. I put up a topic there for people to suggest talking points or to ask direct questions. I'm going to get to those at some point. There's still time if you want to submit any. And if you want to join that group at any point, then I've constantly got my finger on the trigger to accept people unless they have very suspicious sounding names. So, without any further ado, let's first of all take a look at this brand new book on the Mantic website, shall we? So, there we go, only $9.99, which is more than reasonable for a book that in some ways changes the face of Kings of War. Softback supplement book. Now, I'm going to have to confess that I don't have the actual physical book in my hands, but I have been well versed on the changes to the gameplay. There are some things in there that I'm not as familiar with as yet, including some campaign things, shall we say, items and upgrades and abilities that can be applied to your characters and hordes and so on as you go through campaigns, I think. There's big sections on that. So that would be interesting to look at as well when I do get my hands on an actual book. Stu Rat has just appeared in the chat, which rhymes. Wraith 13 as well. So it's filling up in there. Okay, so let's have a look at the description here. So tournament guide, tips from experienced TOs, league guide, writing your own rules, advice on adding your own rules to games. And if you've seen any of my battle reports for various game systems, you'll know that I do have a bit of a habit of adding my own rules into games. I've done quite a lot of that, especially when it comes to Age of Sigmar and Bolt Action, and what else have I thrown my own rules into? I'm sure I've done it for 40k a few times as well, come up with my own ridiculous scenarios. Darren Parks is here and was led to believe this was a stripper show. Well, in some ways, yes, because I am actually allowing members of the audience to go pantless for the duration of this show. It's just the fact that you can't actually see them, nor could you see if I was pantless because I'm only visible from the chest up, or at the moment, not visible at all, because we're looking at this screen here. But for only $9.99, you can't really lose, can you? Often when there's a book like this that comes out that is in addition to a main rule book, people would kind of be hesitant to spend any money on it, and they'd rather just find out what the changes are and then never actually get the book. But I think for just $9.99, there's no harm in having it whatsoever, especially if you're in any way into running leagues and such, or organizing your own tournaments. So I don't think we need to look any further at that right now. So let's drop the old screen share again, and you can look at this beautiful wall of orange. In fact, I can almost be a floating head if I go like that. I'm sure there's some kind of tool in Hangouts that I could use to take away all the orange, and then I would just be a floating head. But last time I tried that, it wasn't very effective. They're actually taking away a lot of the Google Hangout tools in a couple of weeks, I think, which is very strange on their part. There's Ozzy in the chat. Darren Parks is officially pantless now, so is Kyle Poole. Mickey Genver, who is probably pantless. Skeleton Flower is always pantless, as we know. So there's at least 4 pantless people in here right now. And I'm going to leave it to your imagination regarding my state of pantlessness or not. Right, so I've prepared some notes here on the changes in the Clash of Kings book, and I'm going to go through them piece by piece and give you the lowdown on how it affects me, my armies, and any other random thoughts that I have. Kyle Poole says, the first streamer to ever get my name right. Do most people try and pronounce it Sile Pool because it's spelt with a C? There's Green Stuff Games as well, who's attending their first ever live show and is very thrilled about it, as the little smiley face illustrates there. Okay, here we go. So, Clash of Kings book. Some of these changes were kind of already unofficially in effect. And first of all, actually, I'm going to say, even though people will say that these rules are optional and that you don't have to use them, in reality, I would say that the vast majority of tournaments will start to adopt these rules. It's kind of like the way in Age of Sigmar when the General's Handbook came out and they said, well, you don't have to play with points, but here they are if you like. And then in reality, pretty much everyone immediately started playing with points. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a case of that. They're saying it is optional. You can use it in your tournament if you want, but you don't have to. But pretty much everyone probably will adopt all these rules. So a couple of things that were already in effect in pretty much all the tournaments I've been to. For example, maximum 3 of any kind of unit. So I wouldn't be able to have 6 troll hordes like I saw someone did recently at, I think it was the US Masters. So that wouldn't be permitted under these rules, but that's been in effect in all the tournaments I've been to for quite a while, only having 3 of any particular things. You could have 3 troll hordes and then 3 troll regiments if you wanted. But I like that. That doesn't affect me at all because I've already been abiding by that. Next one is quite a big deal. Fireball, lightning bolt, and breath attacks affected by cover. Now, that directly affects me in that I do have a war trombone, but I'm not a war trombone spammer or a war tromboner, if you will. I only have 1. Many people have fielded 3 in their armies since that was the maximum at many of the tournaments. So obviously the strategy with something like that would be to keep them from harm because they can't take much punishment back, and you particularly don't want to get them into combat. So you would sit them behind something that's height 1, they're also height 1, and then if the enemy has lots of height 2 or higher units in front, you can just fire over your own troops willy-nilly and not suffer any penalty at all. But now, cover will actually affect those attacks. So you're going to have to be a little bit more careful with the placement of them and possibly not spam them quite so much. Or if your opponent has spammed them, it's going to be slightly easier to counter them. We've got demon_lizard_from_outer_space in the chat. Hello there. So now I do like to take some of the things that would be affected by this. I obviously used lightning bolt on my goblin wizards, and the diadem of dragonkind is a breath attack, and I do like to take that often on a standard bearer or something like that. So that being affected by cover will make it slightly less potent. And in fact, I've actually been leaning towards the Holy Hand Grenade recently instead, and that isn't affected by this rule, so that still ignores cover. So perhaps we'll see more of the Holy Hand Grenade, because I haven't really seen people use it other than me, and it's slightly cheaper than the Diadem of Dragonkind as well. So we might see more of that. We'll definitely see more of that from me, because I think it's pretty snazzy, unless when we get to the new artifacts, I see something in there that particularly grabs me by the unmentionables and says, you must take this instead. So I do think that's going to be a big deal, because I have seen armies that have been able to spam particularly fireball, lightning bolts, and breath attacks, which of course is everything featured under this new rule. So I've seen spamming of all of those things over the last few months. So we'll see whether that still happens. I'm sure there are certain units it won't affect too much. Anyone who you aren't too concerned about them, so you're not necessarily hiding them behind your own troops. so it wouldn't really affect them. But if your opponent is spamming them, you will then be able to counter it by putting your troops in cover to defend yourself against it. And also shielding your own troops with smaller chaff units, which works against regular shooting, and you'll now be able to use against those attacks that previously always hit on 4+. Stu Rat says Mantic is trying to be edgy. Perhaps. Let's see. Bazooka J Rambo is saying hello to Demon _. Don't know why I felt the need to read that out. Brian Ring, what is the new cheese? Well, I think we're going to get to the new cheese in a minute, but we're going through all the changes first of all, and then there's a few things that have been added, some of which it's been suggested might contain at least trace elements of cheese. If there was going to be an allergy warning on this book, I would say that it will say something along the lines of, it's been manufactured in a plant that also deals with cheese, but there may not be any cheese in there, but there might be, so you have to be careful. That's how I'd look at it. It doesn't look like they've intended to just fill it full of cheese, but there may be trace elements. Okay, so another one that's already been in effect in all the tournaments I've been to, flyers lose their ability to fly and they lose nimble while disordered, which is after they take damage in close combat, which has been a fine change. People have still taken a lot of flyers, so it's obviously not nerfed them that much. Haven't really seen too much of a drop-off of dragon characters and wraiths and so on. Still see quite a lot of flyers. It's still a very, very good ability to have, because you're still deciding when they go into combat in the first place the majority of the time, because there isn't much that's as fast as a flyer. So more often than not, you'll be able to dictate when you're into combat, and you just have to be slightly more careful about when you do that. Whereas previously, you could just willy-nilly charge it into something, take a bit of damage back, and then just fly away. So you have to be careful, but if you're clever about it, it doesn't really affect you that much. If anyone has any comments on any of these as I'm going through them, feel free to drop comments in there. If you've got any particular insight or you want to tap my brain for the juicy tactical goodness within. Green Stuff Games, what are Mantic doing? 2 question marks. Well, that's a bit of a vague question. You might have to be a bit more specific there. They're releasing a book that's tweaking some of the rules for tournament play, is what I would say. Next, now this is a big deal. Bane Chant needs 2 hits to achieve piercing when you're trying to target a shooter unit, essentially. So it still only needs 1 hit for close combat units, but you need 2 on shooty units to get that piercing. And I can't think of anything that has Bane Chant 4. If there is something out there that people know of, let me know. But I've seen a lot of Bane Chant 2 and a few instances of Bane Chant 3. If there's anything with Bane Chant 4, I'm not sure. But that would be the only time where you would, on average, expect to achieve piercing with it. And anything that did have Bane Chant 4, I would imagine, would be obscenely expensive anyway. Maybe something like Morgoth, maybe someone like him has Bane Chant 4. I haven't checked recently. So that's quite a big deal, because shooty hordes were spammed quite a bit. If you look at some of the goblin lists over recent months, then you saw a lot of the spitter hordes being Bane chanted up, which was very, very easy to do. So is that going to steer things more towards close combat? Probably. If it's more difficult to put piercing on your shooter units, and there's another reason that that's going to be a thing that might happen as well later on when we get to that. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Guy Harper says nothing has Bane Chant 4. Okay, makes sense. So on average, you can't expect to achieve piercing using Bane Chant. It's really kind of a throw of desperation there. So you would imagine that anyone that actually has Bane Chant, any wizard, would be better off using their ability to cast something to use a different spell, perhaps, rather than attempting that. Let's see. Okay, so the Pharaoh had already come down to Defense 5, and now the Vampire has joined him on Defense 5. So this is obviously... Oh, Darren Park says Morgoth is Bane Chant 4. Well, conflicting reports there. So he's probably the only one then. But if you're using Morgoth to Bane Chant up a unit to give them piercing, I don't know what you're doing, really, because undead don't have a huge amount of shooting units to begin with. So that's probably a waste of his abilities. Mickey Jenver, are piercings important in Kings of War? Well, I've come up against quite a few players that had visible piercings. Not as many as you might think, and I suppose all of them could have had potential piercings that were under cover, shrouded by clothing, perhaps. So I wouldn't say piercings are that important, but the piercing special rule is quite a big deal, allowing you to take down heavily armoured targets at a safe distance. So the vampire coming down to defense 5. This is quite a big deal. I have taken lists that have 2 vampire lords in the past, one on a horse, one on foot, probably one of them with the wings of honey maze as well, flying around. So there is now, with the other rule that's come in, a certain artifact has been taken away as well, which we'll get to later. Then there is now no way to get your vampire lords up to defense 6. So if you want to have a defense 6 vampire, I think your only option is to go with one of the special named characters. Pretty sure Lady Elona is still defense 6, but obviously she's more expensive, and you can't kit her out with extra items like wings of honey maze and so forth, and you can't put her on a horse. So how will this affect me now? Well, I recently changed my undead list. Well, not that recently, but more recently than the 2 vampire lords. I went with 1 vampire lord and 1 vampire on a Pegasus, who is already defense 5, and there's now going to be no way to boost him back up, but we're not onto that yet. So is it going to make vampires less effective? Well, even regularly kitted out, they're still pretty damn fast, and being individual and just nipping around everything, you can virtually decide who you're going to be fighting. You have to be a little bit more careful, though, because previously, if you threw him into something that didn't have any inherent crushing strength, for example, to hit him back with, then you wouldn't be too worried. With your defense 6, you wouldn't think that they're going to take too much damage. But now, if you're up against any unit, really, that you would normally throw him into, you're starting to think a little bit more now that he might take wounds back. So I'd say it's just going to make people more careful, much like the changes to flyers. I don't think it'll stop people taking vampires. I think it'll just make them a bit less, a bit more concerned about the potential comeback in terms of attacks that the enemy could throw in his direction, I would say. It remains to be seen, though. You have to get quite a few tournaments under your belt and see exactly what people are bringing before you can rush to any judgment on that. Let's see, anyone made any comments on this? Yes, just confirmation that Morgoth is Bane Chant 4. Okay, so next. Night Stalkers. Some of their units have had their nerve reduced. Well, Night Stalkers, I generally see them doing well at tournaments. I can't even remember if I've actually played them. I've probably played them at least once or twice, maybe as allies as well. So I don't have a huge amount of experience to draw from when it comes to the old Night Stalkers, but they did seem to do well. You generally see them performing well at tournaments, and they have been complained about a lot, to put it politely, shall we say. So it makes sense that they would have something dropped on them, and the nerve coming down seems good. It seemed like some of them were quite high from what I've been hearing. So I don't have too much to say about that one because I don't have a huge amount of experience playing against them. Salamanders are generally thought to be underpowered, so some of their units have gained Vicious, which can't hurt, can it? And since they're basically... Well, let's think about if it actually makes sense from a fluff perspective. Salamanders, lizard people being vicious. It makes sense, I suppose. They get their snarly teeth in there and everything, and yeah, their long lizard tongues firing out there. Maybe if they don't wound you with the sword, they'll just give you a bit of a lick. The Trident Realms units, some of them have gained Ensnare. Now, I'm not sure what the reasoning is for that. I'm not sure why fishmen get Ensnare. Maybe they are armed with nets, perhaps. I'm not sure if that's a thing or not. Demon_lizard loves lizard people, apparently. So lizard people and fishmen. So those races that people are always longing to see in other games are well represented in Kings of War now. Some of the new Trident Realms models look really nice, actually, and some of them are actually in resin, not metal, which is very, very nice. Anything that's huge and metal is very, very unwieldy and annoying to handle. So I'm sure that'll improve them because they seem to be very underpowered. I've seen them at a couple of tournaments. I don't think I've played against them much. I may have had one game at some point, but I don't really recall. But they always seem to be in the lower tier of the finishing places in tournaments. Orcs are another army that are really thought to be lower end in competitive sense, and some of their units have gained fury. And I was looking at which units actually have it. It seems to be they have, I think it's called the Fight Wagon. I think that's gained it. There's a couple of infantry units have, but not all of them. I think it's Morax that have gained fury. And if it is, I think that makes sense. I think they're the ones with multiple axes. So they don't hit quite as hard, but they hit more. So you would think, because fury means that even if you become wavered as a result of close combat attacks, you can still countercharge. So you would think they've got so many weapons just swinging them around wildly, even if they get potentially mortally wounded, they can still keep swinging for a minute. So it makes sense that they would have fury, like the way a giant has it. If you cut off a giant's toe, you're just going to make it mad, and it's still going to hit you back, even if it's really distressed. It's just going to be like jumping around in agony, so it's still going to land on you and do some damage, probably. So I suppose it makes sense for some orcs to get fury. So those are the main changes to existing things. So let's talk about the artifacts that have gone away now, actually, because this kind of ties in. So you can no longer take ensorcelled armor, which is what I previously used to get my Pegasus vampire up to defense 6, along with my other vampire lord who was already defense 6. So now I wouldn't be able to do that, and I would have to rest both of them on defense 5, which is a lot of points tied up in 2 defense 5 units that are looking a lot more vulnerable all of a sudden. So that did seem to be a must-have. You generally saw that in an awful lot of armies because there were a lot of those big monsters that had defense 5 with a hero mounted on them, and people would typically take ensorcelled armor to get them up to defense 6, because that does make a big difference. Aussie, don't the Trident Realms have an army rule ensnare, but then many of their units don't get it, so they added it to make it a theme rather than an occasional ensnare? That sounds about right, yes. Let's see. Todd Serpico says, Rule of 3 is hero, monster, and war engine only. Is it? Interesting. Well, I suppose it depends on a tournament by tournament basis then, doesn't it? Because most of the tournaments, I would say, that I've attended have had a rule that you can't have more than 3 of anything. So you would have to take regiments and hordes and a mixture of the two if you wanted to take multiple of the same kind of unit. So, as I said, I haven't actually seen the physical copy of this book yet. But if that is the change, it would puzzle me why they haven't expanded it to regular units as well, not having 3 of the same type. Okay, so where were we? Rob Lloyd, sweet, has popped into the chat. Brian Ring says, Fiends going to 15-17 Nerve are going to force people to go more shooting. 2 mind screeches, anyone? Well, a lot of the other changes in here also seem to not exactly benefit shooting lists, though. So who knows? Okay, next. The Brew of Keen Eyeness has gone away, which was, of course, +1 to hit on shooty units. So it's now more difficult to Bane Chant shooter units. You can't give them the +1 to hit item anymore because it doesn't exist. So they really don't want tournaments being dominated by big shooting hordes, do they? Because, of course, you wouldn't typically put that much expense into anything smaller than a horde with such an expensive item. So they're obviously wanting to move away from that. And there are some other changes coming up as well, where you would think that's something they want to steer away from, shall we say. Sean Blake is now in the chat as well. Okay, so is that going to affect me? Well, I didn't take it that much. I've tried using it on Goblin Spitter Hordes, but it is quite expensive for them. It doesn't actually make them that amazing. So more often than not, I probably didn't take it, but it was definitely something I have used, and it's now one less option. Most of the Goblin players and the people on the various green skin Facebook groups have been talking about how it's the death of Goblin shooting with the Spitter Hordes and how you're going to have to go in other directions if you want your shooting now. So someone earlier asked, is it going to go more towards war machines with the goblins? And I would say that yes, the big rock thrower is so scary. If you have more than one of them, you're just dishing out damage at incredibly long range for an incredibly low cost, I think. It may be the cheapest rock thrower in the game. If anyone knows of a cheaper one, let me know. But it is cheap. I think it's only 80 points. I know the undead one is at least 100. So I'm not sure about other armies, but the goblin one is very, very cheap. And the sharp stick thrower, I'm not as much of a fan of the sharp stick thrower, but having it as part of a little artillery battery is nice because you're guaranteed to get at least some hits if you have some of those because they have more shots, basically. They're just not quite as good. So I can definitely see people rocking up with 3 big rock throwers and maybe slightly less war trombones and maybe no spitter hordes at all. So I think it's going to be all about the rock throwers in the new meta, if you will. I know I'm definitely thinking about getting a second one. And I never invested in a second war trombone. I could still probably do with one at some point, just for a bit of options, a bit more variety in my list building. Aussie, sadly, I see elf armies now being forest shamblers, herders, dragons, and drakens now. Elf infantry too squishy, cavalry no crushing strength. Well, we shall see. Elves are generally quite strong, aren't they? They've done quite well at a lot of tournaments, so who knows? Fluffy Dread, hi all, my first Friday show live. Hello. Okay, what are we up to now? Okay, Medallion of Life. Well, that is the item that puts regen 5+ on a unit, well, on a hero, basically. So you can't take that anymore. And as far as I'm aware, people took that on things such as dragon characters when they didn't take ensorcelled armor. Obviously, if you had 2 in the same list, you couldn't take ensorcelled armor on both. So they would put ensorcelled armor on one, maybe Medallion of Life on the other to give it regen. I don't think I've ever used the Medallion of Life. I have used the other item that affects regen, the Onyx Ring, I think it is. I've used that on a Troll Bruiser to give it regen 4+ at some point. And come to think of it, I have actually used ensorcelled armor on the Troll Bruiser as well in the past, which puts him up to defense 6, so I can't do that anymore either. But generally, I don't do that anymore. I try and keep him a bit cheaper nowadays. So no more Medallion of Life, less access to regen because of that. So there's just less ways that you could make your big ultra nasty characters even more ultra nasty, essentially. That seems to be the way it's going. So you can still take them. They just don't have those particular auto-include items on them anymore. Whether certain other items will move up and fill the void and be just as overused remains to be seen. Bazooka J. Rambo, I always imagine the comedy trombone tune when I hear war trombones. War trombones, even if they were terrible in the game, which they are far from, even with the changes to breath weapons, they are still very, very, very tasty for their very cheap point value. Good old war trombones, still very handy indeed. Okay, so before we go into the new artifacts, let's talk about the new scenarios, shall we? It's because there's at least some of these that I would say lend credibility to the idea that shooting is not necessarily on the way out, but being limited. So now I think I've got the names of some of these scenarios wrong in the past, maybe in some of my reports, or maybe they were just named differently at the tournaments I went to because they weren't officially available yet. So let's start with Ransack is the first new one. And I've definitely played this one. This is the one where, as you're about to place the pillage markers around, essentially, then they gain a random value rather than just being worth 1 victory point. And I found it very interesting because do you put all the valuable ones together? Do you put the valuable ones on one side, hoping that you'll get that side to deploy on? Or if you're planning on moving everything forward, do you hope to put them where your enemy's going to be? So yeah, it adds another layer, basically, since every token is no longer worth the same. Because very rarely are both sides of the table completely identical. Usually there are subtle differences, like one side will have a forest right near their deployment area, and the other side might just have a field that's difficult terrain. So you would be thinking, well, which side do I want here? Do I want a forest, or do I want this difficult terrain? Do I want an obstacle? Do I want an obstacle at that angle? Do I want an obstacle like on the other side, which is at a slightly different angle? And you'd be thinking, which side does your opponent want? And maybe you can entice them into taking a side that isn't favorable to their army by putting expensive tokens there. So there's a lot that's supposed to be going on in your brain here during the deployment phase, where often the clock is running. So I'm not sure how much of that people actually go into mentally before a game, but it's definitely something to think about. Secure, which is one that I have played as well, which is hold terrain pieces. So rather than objectives, you're just having to sit next to pieces of terrain, which does encourage the terrain layout to be somewhat more even on tables. Other than that, there's not a huge amount to say about that one. It means that you can control things without being as close to the enemy. If a terrain piece is particularly long or wide, then you don't have to be in threat range of the enemy. If it's a little house, you could be sat behind it completely out of their sight if you've got a small enough unit to completely avoid being attacked and still either contest it and stop them claiming points for it or get points for it yourself. So it's an interesting one. Scour. So I played this one. It's basically the same as Pillage, or is it Pillage or Loot? I can't remember, where you pick up the markers. But either way, so you can destroy markers when you pick them up, is the main difference here. And reasons you might want to do this is because when the enemy kill a unit, they can choose whether to take the token off you. So if you know that your unit is about to be destroyed and you're about to give up a valuable token to the enemy, then you can basically scuttle it and just destroy the token. So there are situations where you would want to do that. Maybe you have one really fast unit that just sneaks around the back of the enemy's army, goes into their setup area and just starts destroying all the tokens. That would certainly be an option. Although if you're that fast, maybe you could actually escape with them. Then you've got Occupy, which is several markers are on the table, and you get more if you sit on the one that's in your opponent's area. So this is the modified version of the scenario where you would take table quarters, I think, pretty much. So rather than it just being divided up into sections of the table, it's now on particular spots. I think that is the difference anyway. Because I think they want to move away slightly from scenarios where you're controlling a particular territory, because it gets a bit fiddly. And like if the very back of someone's base is outside it, then you don't claim it. So it's a little bit annoying having to measure and draw lines all over the table. So it's easiest to just say, here's a marker, go after this. Then we've got, oh, some people are making some comments here. Sean Blake is wondering where Rem is. Well, of course, this isn't the Andy and Rem show, and Mr. Remington Steele is not into Kings of War at all. I did give him one game of it, and he seemed to like it. But I think he's got too much on his plate with being an international music legend and also playing Age of Sigmar. Right, next. I think this one's Scavenge. Now, what I've managed to glean from this without actually looking at the book is that there is one spot on the table that spawns tokens for you to collect, pretty much. So if you're sitting in a particular area, you'll then gain a token. And obviously the unit that sits there puts themselves as a prime target for the enemy. And you would think that you'd get really tough units, sit them on it, spew out a few tokens, maybe drop them behind yourself, get another unit to pick them up and run away, perhaps. I have to have a proper look at that one in the book before commenting further, because there may be some subtle intricacies that I'm not getting there. Then we've got Eliminate, which I have played, which is where there's a bounty on your 3 most expensive units. And the aim is to kill them in close combat. So you could kill them with shooting, but you don't get any points for that. If they survive the game, then the person who has those units does gain a victory point, though, but you get 2 if you kill them from shooting. So if you kill them in close combat, should I say. So you'd shoot them down as a last resort to stop them surviving the game, but your main aim is to bring them down in close combat. So another suggestion that perhaps the game is moving away from shooty lists, or they're trying to push people slightly away from shooting spam, because really you could wipe out a lot of the enemy's army with shooting and still lose because you lost one of your bounty units in close combat. And in fact, I did a battle report on this against the League of Rordia recently on this particular scenario, and that almost happened. I'm not going to spoil the ending, so if you want to go and check that out at some point. Next. Right, let's look at... Actually, I haven't quite finished talking about that one. So on the fact that it's on your 3 most expensive units, usually those are your big fighter units. If it was my undead, it would probably be a vampire on a Pegasus, the Soul Reaver cavalry, and maybe werewolves, perhaps. So they're all hard-hitting units, but especially now that I can't put ensorcelled armor on the Pegasus, they can all potentially be harmed by enemies hitting back at them now. And that wouldn't be nice if they've got a bounty on them. They are generally going to get killed in close combat, those units, because they're all fast and they want to take the fight to the enemy. So they're going to want to charge in and often leave themselves open to a counter charge. So you're going to have to be careful with those expensive units that you would perhaps rely on, using them as shock troops in the past. Maybe you're going to have to be a bit more conservative with them, make greater use of chaff, and block the counter charge routes a bit more than you previously would have. With my goblins, that would generally be trolls or giants that would be the most expensive units, which are typically the most survivable goblin units anyway. But again, you do want them to get into combat. I will say it's not a bad thing for the giants to have, because they're not that vulnerable in close combat. They're much more scared of shooting than they are hand-to-hand, because due to the Fury rule, if you waver a giant, they can still countercharge. So it's hard to kind of build up the momentum against a giant to kill it compared to other units. And trolls, they have a decent nerve, but it's really the regeneration that's annoying with them. If you can't take them out in one go, then a lucky roll can see them getting a lot of their wounds back. So, yes, you still have to be careful with them, though, if there's a bounty on their head. Okay. Let's talk about the new spells, shall we? So there are 3 of those. Obviously, Kings of War doesn't have that many spells in it, and that was one of the things that potential converts from Warhammer 8th edition didn't like about Kings of War, the fact it didn't have a huge variety of spells, but there are a few more in the arsenal now. So Weakness is the first one, which is really a reverse Bane chant. So you put this on a unit, an enemy unit, to make it weak, and they're then on -1 to wound, which is fine. I could see it being quite handy. It depends what you're coming up against, really. And it also depends on the makeup of your opponent's army. If they're going for hordes, of course, it'd be good because you're putting -1 to wound on a lot of attacks. If they bring a lot of cheaper, smaller units, obviously it's not that great because you can only affect one of those units. So quite a few of these seem to be nudging people away from taking tons and tons of hordes, or nothing but hordes. You can't really take tons of them because they're so expensive. Brian Ring, Andy plays the scenarios very well. Now, if only he would learn what all the units do. That's going to come with time. Because obviously, once you've played a scenario once, you know how it works, and you start to formulate the tactics in your mind, the gears start working around in there, the little hamsters operating wheels inside your tactical brain. But when it comes to learning what units do, you generally have to play against them a few times because you're going to come up against a lot of different units. And if it's an army that you don't play against very much, committing it to memory is not that easy. So with time, it'll come though. When it comes to playing against, let's say, Abyssals now, I think I have the gist of what all their stuff does from playing about 3 games against them. So after a few games, you do start to understand it a bit more. I know some people just study the book endlessly, so they know exactly what every unit does before they ever get to the tournament hall. But I'm not one of those people. Generally, I just play the tournaments as a learning experience and try and improve each time, which is the case. In fact, I might pull up my tournament record in a second. Let's see here. Okay. Grabbing it. And let's get it in the old screen share here. Okay, so here is my ranking in the Fields of Blood. So as you can see, it's got my position in every tournament that I've played in. You can see my first one was not that successful, but I feel like I barely knew how to play Kings of War over a year ago. So finishing 15th in my first one wasn't too bad. And I started with Undead here. In the second one, then you can see I actually finished 4th out of 12 in my second ever tournament, which I found very, very impressive. But then my goblins were ready, because I was really just using the Undead to fill in so I could attend tournaments while I was painting up my goblins. And then you can see I actually did quite terribly in 3 tournaments in a row there. So 17th out of 22, 14 out of 16, 10th out of 12, all in a row with the goblins, not very good at all. And my lowest ever score at a tournament was that one, Doom of the Kindred Lord. But then I went back to Undead, and it picked up 9th out of 26. Then it got better, 5th out of 16. Then it got even better, 5th out of 20. And I felt, you know what? I'm a Kings of War maestro at this stage. I've finished 5th in 2 tournaments in a row. I'm essentially a god by this point. So maybe I can go back to goblins. I've got a few more models now. I can up my performance, and that did prove to be the case. So 8th out of 16, very respectable, especially by my previous goblin standards. And then my best performance so far, 2nd out of 14 at the Woodland Realm, which I'm very, very, very proud of. And with a bit more luck, maybe I could have won that one. You never know, it was pretty close. The only person that defeated me was the winner of the tournament. Then the most recent tournament out of 18, finishing 7th, which I'm very proud of again. I won 3 out of 5 games there and only lost 1. So I think my tournament performances are definitely showing steady improvement. And who knows, maybe I'll actually win one at some point. I wouldn't be surprised. I've finished 2nd before, so it's not that much of a leap, is it? That's my goal, to eventually win a tournament now. Previously, my goal was to just win a game at each tournament, but I'm actually looking to win one at some point now. And then I won't retire happy, but I can just kind of coast along on the glory of that one win, I think. Okay, let's stop looking at that. Okay, where were we? Okay, we were talking about the spells. So weakness, reverse Bane Chant. Could I see myself taking that on any of my casters? Maybe. I would definitely try out all these spells at some point, but I can't see it immediately jumping in to one of the slots, because if I think about what my casters generally do, for the undead, then my necromancer is generally going to be surging people around, and when he's not doing that, I would think he's going to be bane chanting my own units, because especially if I'm still taking zombie legions, there's so many attacks there that are going to benefit from that extra bit of crushing strength on them. But we'll see. Then we've got Blood Boil. Now this is one that was a little bit controversial. So the way this one works is the number of shots is equal to the number of wounds on the target unit. So the more wounded it is, the more potent the attack is. This is another thing that leads me to say they want to nudge people away from big giant hordes. Because if you have a ton of nerve and really low defense, this is extra bad news for you. It has piercing 1 on it as well. So let's say a zombie legion. Normally, well, let's see, I think zombie legion is nerve 26. I think that's right. I haven't used it for a few months. So you generally have to be like above 18. Well, if you get to 14 damage, you can actually start rolling the dice if it is 26. It might actually be 28, the nerve on the Zombie Legion. That sounds right, actually. So you have to get to 16 before it's even worth rolling the dice. So if you get them up to, say, 14 damage, you're not even at a point where you could even bother rolling a nerve check for them. But if you've got them up that high, suddenly Blood Boil being cast on them is going to have 14 shots at them. So you're going to get 7 hits probably. And then with that 1 piercing, you're going to be wounding them on 2s. So you're probably going to put like another 6 damage on them, which is going to put them perilously close to being in danger. So that in those circumstances, if you're seeing a lot of hordes, and especially legions with low defense, then I could see that being very, very useful. Brian Ring says, I would say most of your losses I saw were because you were surprised by units' abilities. Yes, that has happened quite a few times, but it doesn't happen with the same unit multiple times. Once I know what something does, I know what to look out for. The one thing that definitely caught me out that I can think of right now was that really powerful ogre character like Grokmer Garak or something that is absolutely insane, and I just thought he'd be kind of like a troll bruiser in his potency, but he's actually an absolute monster, and he killed one of my vampires in one go. So that was a particularly one. Brian Ring, it's all good, you're getting good, especially with those gobbos. Yeah, I'm getting more of the knack for the goblins now. Darren Park says, Grok a Gamok. Yes, not to be confused with Gakamak. Yeah, I don't like the fact that they name things so similarly. I suppose GW are just as bad with the names of their units, like Blood Rippers and Blood Renders and Blood Secretors and everything with blood and skull in it. So all the companies do it, really. Okay, so anything else on Blood Boil? Would it stop me taking the double zombie legion or trying out the triple zombie legion? It depends if people take this spell and whether they would take more than one instance of it. If people were to take 2 lots of this spell, I would be very, very worried for my 3 zombie legions, and I would regret my life choices immediately. If there's any one of these spells on the table, I wouldn't be overly concerned if I had multiple legions. And really, it's got shorter range than things like Lightning Bolt. So on average, there's only certain circumstances where it's going to be better than those. But against zombie legions is definitely one of those circumstances. So I'll probably still take the legions unless we start to see just an endless torrent of Blood Boil all over the place, if people are taking just tons of it. In which case, I probably would have to rein in my legion instinct a bit. But we'll see. It has the potential to ruin those units. Soul Drain is the third one. So this only has very short range, but this can be cast into combat. And it has Piercing 1. I didn't see how many dice it actually has. So if someone knows that, drop it in the chat, and I'll get to that. But for every wound it does, you can then heal a unit that many wounds, a unit within 6 inches. So any armies that don't have access to heal, this could be a good one, because you're damaging, especially if you're an army that relies on attrition and your own units aren't that good at grinding down the enemy because their attacks are so terrible. So I'm thinking like the heavily armored dwarf units. Although, could an allied wizard use it to put wounds onto the enemy and then heal allied dwarf units? I don't know. Someone will have to let me know on that point, because I know you're not supposed to cast spells on allied units, but could you use that one? Because they're not the initial target of the spell. I don't know. It probably says in the book. So let's see. For goblins, what would I do with Soul Drain? Well, I could use that to boost the self-healing prowess of the trolls and make them really annoying to shift. Or, more likely, I would probably use it to put wounds back onto the giant. Darren Park says it rolls 6 dice. Right, so depending what you're targeting here, if you're fighting something like, let's say, a goblin horde with a giant, normally that's a long slog for you to get through. But goblins are only low defense. Not as low as zombies, but they're low-ish. So if you use this on the goblins, you might do 3 wounds to them, and then heal a single non-allied unit. Right, okay, that clarifies that. So, casting this with a goblin wizard, not a goblin wizard. Yes, a goblin wizard. On enemy goblins. That's just going to make it more confusing. Let's just say it is zombies. So my goblin's fighting against some zombies. I've got a giant in combat with zombies. It's going to be difficult for him to get through. But I've got the wizard there who casts Soul Drain onto the zombies. They're low defense, so he's going to get quite a lot of wounds. Let's say he gets 4. He'd have to get a bit lucky to get a lot of wounds, but you're going to get a few probably. And then he can heal the giant with that, because giants don't normally have a way to heal, because goblins don't have a huge access to healing. They take healing charm, of course, but that's not much at all. On average, you're only going to get 1 or 2 wounds back with that. So really, that could be quite tasty. I would definitely consider trying that to heal up my giants, because giants are very tough to shift, but once you get the nerve high enough, of course, you can take them out. So giving them the ability to heal would be quite interesting. It's just a question of whether it's worth taking that over another spell is the main issue there. But I would say that sounds quite promising, and you can only heal one unit with it at a time by the looks of it. So it sounds interesting. I can see applications for it. It's just a question of how efficient it is compared to everything else. Brian Ring says Blood Boil looks good, Soul Drain, nah. Yeah, people are saying that the cheese is found in Blood Boil. I just imagine it's like a vat of boiling blood with just like cartoon cheese with the holes in just bobbing up and down in there, in the bubbles. Let's see. Okay, I suppose we should go on to the artifacts now, shouldn't we? And then I'll do kind of a roundup of everything at the end. So, well, in fact, before we do that, let's see what I would do with my undead with a bit of soul drain. I suppose it would be useful for, again, the units that maybe you would desperately want to heal up. Something like a zombie legion, you might not bother using it on them to get their wounds back. But I could see a purpose for soul draining to get some extra wounds onto Soul Reaver Cavalry, something like that with high defense, where it's going to be tough to get those wounds off again. It could be quite handy there. Okay. Bazooka Jarambo, cheese and blood. Mickey Geneva, vat of boiling cheese. I could see that. It'd be like a pizza when you open the oven and the cheese is just bubbling up. Darren Park, 6 dice is only 3 hits and then you have to wound. Yes. So, on average, you're not going to get a huge amount. If you're lucky, you could get 3 or 4, depending what you're hitting. If you're hitting something with really low defense like zombies, you're going to get more back than you are against something with high defense, obviously. So basically, you want to sap the strength of weak units and apply it to your strong units. So it can be useful, but situational. Okay, and also Jason Britt points out, yes, that is true. I did say that you can cast it into an enemy in combat. So doubly useful. And that does make it very, very interesting, Soul Drain. And like I said, I'm definitely going to give it a try at some point. Okay, then let's have a look at the artifacts now. So we have, let's start with the Healing Brew. So for 5 points, you can heal D3 wounds. Well, that's pretty simple, pretty easy, and it's just one of those really cheap artifacts where you've got 5 points left over, where normally you would look at the likes of the Blade of Slashing and the Mace of Crushing and Fire Oil, things like that. They're just really cheap, but they do come in handy, and that'll be thrown into that mix now. And I would imagine people would take that on their characters when they don't want to invest money in a big artifact on them. Something like a Troll Bruiser, that would be a perfect item for him, I think, because it's nice and cheap, it doesn't make him too expensive, and it complements his ability to already regenerate. So, at the beginning of the turn when you regenerate, if you don't regen quite as many wounds as you like and you think he's in a bit of trouble, just drop that Healing Brew, sup on that, and get D3 wounds back in addition to whatever you regenerated. So I could see a use for that. And I would consider taking it on a Troll Bruiser, perhaps, to try out. Sparkstone. This is a really interesting one. So 18-inch range, hits on a 4. And if you hit the enemy, then they become disordered. Now, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't have to do a wound or anything to them. It just disorders them. So, if there's enemy flyers in front of you, this would be particularly useful if you're a wizard that is fast. And because it's an artifact, it doesn't even have to be a wizard. So any character that is fast, then moving closer to flyers is obviously easier the faster you are, because they can outrun you if you're slow. But you can easily get to within 18 inches of a flyer if you've got, for example, a goblin flagget or something with this spell artifact. And you could disorder a flyer, stop them flying, and leave them vulnerable to attack in the future. It'd be a handy one for the end of a game if there's a flyer that's about to just pounce and claim a particular objective or something. and you can disorder them just by shooting them, whereas normally you couldn't. You'd have to rely on killing them outright if they're not in a position where you can charge them. So that's useful, but situational. For 10 points, I could see it being handy, though. You would find situations in a tournament where you would want to use that, I'm sure. Just depends whether you could justify putting it on one of the characters, because there are a lot of juicy artifacts that you would like to use. For example, on my Goblin Flaggets, I normally like to put the Holy Hand Grenade, which I mentioned earlier. Jason Britt says bonus on Soul Drain is I believe you can cast it. Yeah, I already read that bit out. It's just because he followed up on that by saying, or am I incorrect? No, that is right. You can cast it into combat. Okay, next, Helm of the Ram. So 15 points. This gives you Thunderous Charge 1. And the first thing I thought of when I saw this was Fleabags. So they have Thunderous Charge 1 already. And if there's any unit in the game that is guaranteed to dictate when they get the charge in, it would probably be Fleabags. And normally you don't want to put an expensive artifact on them because they're not that great and they can die very easily. But giving them Thunderous Charge 2 with that 20-inch charge, and often you're not able to Bane chant them because they're running away so fast that casters can't always keep up with them. And you might not necessarily want your caster to go where they're going. So I would say that would be one I would try out on the Fleabags, certainly giving them extra Thunderous Charge. Other armies, cavalry, could definitely benefit from it, but you're less likely to guarantee yourself a charge because they don't have the same ridiculous speed that Fleabags do. So if anyone else has any suggestions for units that these artifacts would be really good on, then drop them in the comments, and I will assess your tactical prowess. Okay, then. Blood of the Old King, 15 points. For 1 turn, it makes you elite and vicious. Well, that's very, very useful. Often if you have a really nasty fighter unit, if you have a really nasty fighter unit, you might want to put an even better item on them. But sometimes you may only get 1 turn where you're really getting into that really beefy, juicy combat that you want, where you're just going to completely mangle a really expensive unit. So it would be a good thing to use there. And some of these, I'm not sure if they're individual only, because the info I've read on them didn't specify that, so I'm going to assume some of them are. Next, Banner of the Griffin, 20 points. Rallying 1. Now, rallying is something that features a lot in some of the books that I haven't seen, so I can't even remember what rallying actually does right now. So someone tell me in the chat, and I'll come back to that one in a minute. It's refresh my memory, because I haven't seen it in action. Dragon Charge Shield, 20 points. Halt or pivot, and once per game, you can increase your defense by 2. Very, very, very useful. But again, situational. If you've got something that's defense 4, for instance, and it's the last turn, and you've sat right on a crucial area of the battlefield or an objective, you need that unit to survive, then increasing its defense by 2 and then just accepting the charge while you're at defense 6. I could see that being very, very useful. I could see that being taken on certain units that aren't capable of dictating the charge. You can put people off going after you for a turn. So I'm thinking like dwarves here. Some of the dwarf units that don't have the highest defense. A lot of them do have high defense, but not all of them. And they are often going to get charged first. Some of those big dwarf hordes with the big axes, perhaps. That'd be a nice one for them. Darren Parks, rally is +1 nerve to all units within 6 inches. Okay, yeah, that's it. So, handy. 20 points. Putting extra nerve on all the units around. So it's kind of like a similar way to the Orc War Drum works, but not quite as good. That is kind of the Orcs thing, so it shouldn't be as good. So I could see that being very, very useful, because really you do pay quite a lot of points if you want to put extra nerve on your units. I think the item, the Brew of Courage, I think that's 15 points. And that's, of course, that's only for 1 unit. So putting potentially extra nerve on several units at once for only 20 points, potentially good. And Darren Park says War Drums plus Rally gives +3 nerve. Well, that's going to be quite potent then, enhancing that particular ability that Orcs already had. Let's see. Hammer of Measured Force. So this is 20 points, and you always wound on a 4+. Handy, but it depends what you're coming up against. If you find you're up against nothing but zombies, then it's not going to be particularly useful at all. It'd be a really fun one in closed lists, that, Because if the enemy doesn't know you've got it, and then they charge into you with something that has high defense, thinking they're going to be safe from the counterattack, then they just won't be. Open lists, not quite as useful, of course, but that'd be a really good one for closed lists. Loot of Insatiable Darkness. Now, this was quite a controversial one as well. 20 points, Bane Chant 2. So normally you pay a lot of points for a wizard for the ability to take Bane Chant, but now you can just put it on, let's say, a standard bearer, who can just be Bane Chanting people, freeing up your wizard to perhaps use a different spell. Because if you think about it, a wizard typically, it's a lot of points just to be adding Crushing Strength to one unit each turn, paying that much for the wizard and then often paying extra for Bane Chant. So being able to put Bane Chant on another character that's perhaps cheaper and then using another spell with the wizard. And I'm going to jump straight to the next one because that ties in. The Zephyr Crown, I think it is. I haven't actually seen this one written down. I just heard someone talking about it on a video. But 20 points for Wind Blast +4. So if you already have Wind Blast, like a Goblin with Wind Blast 5 is one of their spell options, you put them up to Wind Blast 9. And I would be really tempted to try that one out on my Goblin Wizard. And then maybe put Bane Chant. If I'm taking a lot of Goblin infantry that need the extra Crushing Strength, then put the Bane Chant on the Flaggit. But generally I take a lot of Trolls and Giants and Troll Bruisers and Mincers and that kind of thing, so I don't usually require that much Bane Chant in close combat anyway. So the ability to have Wind Blast 9 on a Goblin is very, very nice. And of course you're going to see League of Rordia. I think it's the Sorcerer, the Halfling Sorcerer, is it, that has Wind Blast 7? So Wind Blast 11 would be ridiculous. So you're just blasting people all over the place, and I'm going to try this one with the Goblin Wiz at some point, certainly, because Wind Blast is something I've wanted to test out more after seeing how potent it was in a game against me. So, especially if I'm taking like a troll-heavy list, where they're fast, but there are going to be units faster than them. So if you're not in a position to dictate the charge, just push the enemy away, and they can't charge you anymore. So, and you can get even closer to wherever you need to be. For example, a particular zone that you need to be scoring points in. If the enemy were holding you close to the middle, they were just sitting on the outside of your charge range, but inside theirs, then force them to sit in your charge range or risk being pushed far enough away so that they can't even charge. So lots of fun things you can do with Wind Blast, lots of fun shenanigans, pushing enemy units into range of shooting attacks or into line of sight for shooting attacks. Very, very tasty potentially there. Shroud of the Saint, 25 points. Increase heal by 2. I'm sure that's going to be very handy for the armies that have access to heal. I don't really use it particularly. I know necromancers can take heal, but I don't think I've actually used it. And even with the ability to bump that up by 2, I can't necessarily see myself taking it instead of Surge. If I was just taking an army made up entirely of, let's say, Soul Reaver Cavalry, werewolves and such, and I didn't need to Surge anything, then I would consider that, but then I probably wouldn't take a Necromancer under those circumstances then. So, yeah, I'm sure some armies would like to have their healing abilities boosted, especially those that don't have a huge amount of it to go around. Okay, so we've gone through all of the items now, and I think I pointed out all the ones that I'm eager to try out. So, I want to try out the extra Wind Blast on a Goblin Wizard. I want to try out the Helm for the extra Thunderous Charge on Fleabags. And what else did I say? Healing Brew on a Troll Bruiser. I think would complement his abilities nicely. A lot of these seem to be focused on Goblins here because I've been playing them a lot recently. I'm going to be playing Undead again soon though. I haven't played them for a while. And what did I say would be a useful one? Soul Drain I want to try out with the Goblins. Healing the Giants with it, potentially. And what else? Blood Boil. I'm usually the one fielding the giant units that would be harmed by Blood Boil being taken, so we'll see. If I see a lot of hordes around, it might be fun. Drunken Deer, sorry off topic, but do you play Frostgrave out of curiosity, and or would you? I have not played it, but if someone wanted to teach me the rules, then I would certainly give it a go, because I've heard good things about it. I haven't heard much of it recently. It seems to, I'm not going to say it's necessarily died off, because I'm sure it hasn't, but there isn't the same momentum and the general excitement around it. When the rulebook came out, even people that had no intention of playing it were buying the book and saying, have you seen this amazing new rule set, this Frostgrave? It's amazing. You can use any fantasy miniatures for it. And then I never heard them talk about it again. So whether it's the momentum's just completely died off, whether it's just sailing under the radar at the moment, I don't know. Let's see. Drunken Deer, could you also field an all-giant army? If you're talking about Kings of War still there, then you can't. So I could take 3 giants, and I do actually have a 3rd giant over here, which I'm working on, which I feel like I'm doing myself a competitive disservice, though, because one of my giants, the first one I did, wouldn't fit on a 50mm base. I did it on 60mm. So I've done the next 2 on 60mm as well, even though they could fit on something smaller, just because I wanted all my giants to be on the same size base, so it's not confusing for people. So maybe it's a bit of a silly move, because I've seen people go to extraordinary lengths to get their giant monsters onto 50mm bases, because obviously the smaller footprint you have, the less units can get in to attack you, the more you can maneuver around enemies and so on. Let's see. Karchev 23, how competitive are Forces of the Abyss? I bought a whole army and they're just sitting there in a box with no love. The Forces of the Abyss seem to do quite well. They don't seem to be up there where the likes of Night Stalkers and Elves have been, in my estimation, but it's quite balanced across the board in Kings of War. You wouldn't be hugely surprised if one of the less competitive armies finished really high or even won a tournament, and you wouldn't be surprised if you saw one of the really favoured armies at the bottom of a tournament. So it depends a lot more on player skill than certain games. Darren Parks' Abyss are one of the strongest lists out there. Yep, that's been my experience. Graham Riggs says pirate version of Frostgrave on the way. Sounds interesting. Everyone loves pirates. Darren Parks, we don't have a competitive Abyssal player, to be honest, in the UK. Yeah, I was trying to think, have I seen anyone actually win a tournament with Abyss? And I can't think that I have. I can't think of one off the top of my head. But I'm sure, but especially with the full Mantic army out now, pretty much. I don't know if they've got models for everything, but they've got a good range to go with. Then I could see one of the competitive players, one of the really hardcore big winners in the community, picking up Abyssals at some point and doing well with them. I could definitely see that. Let's see. Darren Parks, Jeff Swan won last year's Lone Wolf with Abyssals. Well, there you go. Okay, any other thoughts on this Clash of Kings book that I'm not even looking at before I move on to something else? Okay, the new scenarios, I like all of them, really. The ones that I haven't played yet, obviously, I don't know. I think the only one I haven't really played is the Scavenge mission. I think that's the only one I haven't actually sampled yet. So I'll obviously give you my experiences on that as and when I get around to playing that. But I've played all the others and don't really have any issues with them. No real complaints. Obviously, if you're going to go with the scenario that requires the terrain to be nice and even, then you're going to have a tournament organizer who sets the tables up nicely. Drunken Deer, I wanted to do a League of Rordia army. Did they release a big battalion plastic box yet? No, I don't think Mantic do any halflings at this stage. There are a billion halfling manufacturers out there, but not any that I know of where the army is in plastic. A few people do resin halflings, I think, but most of them are metal, which is quite annoying. If they did a plastic halfling army, I think it would sell like hot cakes. Brian Ring says Flying Breath 20. That seems to be a very out of context comment there. You're going to have to enlighten us as to what you're replying to there with that Flying Breath 20 remark. Okay, so any other thoughts on the artifacts? Let's see. Anything else that just immediately grabs me? I don't think so. don't think any of the other artifacts, other than the ones I've mentioned, say to me, you must give me a try in your armies. I'm sure people that play the other factions would have different thoughts on it, because I'm just thinking what would be handy for undead, and particularly goblins, since I've been playing a lot of them recently. And I'm thinking of replacements for the artifacts I would already use on those units. And the ones that I'm looking at are generally cheaper. I still don't see anything that would make me really serious about taking the Holy Hand Grenade away from the Flaggit. Although taking the Inspiring Talisman away from the Wiz is a definite possibility with that Wind Blast item. I definitely want to try that at some stage. That would also allow the wizard to whiz around a bit more, and I do generally take 2 wizards anyway, so I could still have Inspiring Talisman on one of them. Drunken Deer, hate resin, but for characters, metal is better. For mobs, plastic is better, as detail isn't as important. Plastic is king, but I would much rather have resin than metal, I think. Metal, it's just annoying, it's heavy if you're transporting your army, paint can get chipped much more easily. Resin, even Restic, I much prefer using Restic to metal. Like, for example, these wonderful Mantic Trolls with Snotling on the end. These are in Restic, and I very much like dealing with Restic in these cases. It's very easy to repose the arms. These ones aren't reposed at all, but that's just because I've barely used the generic poses, so I thought I'd better have some with the standard arm posing. And then when I get the next 2 trolls to stick with this unit, I'm going to repose their arms as well. So it's very easy to drill into Restic. Drilling into plastic is a little bit troublesome sometimes if you're trying to do it fast and you're using an actual tool with power supplied into it, because you can actually melt the plastic and it kind of clogs up the drill bits, which gets annoying. And I experienced that a lot when I was drilling holes directly through the torsos of my plastic Mantic goblins, so I could run a pin all the way through and then drill into the metal arm components, so I could slot them on, because the arms for many of the goblins are metal and the plastic bodies. So I definitely recommend pinning those in place. Drunken Deer, your mincer always seems in your videos to not pull its weight just from observation. Yeah, people have made good use of a mincer, though. Maybe I haven't used it to the best of its abilities yet. But generally, it's going to be handy for sitting behind your lines, because it can't take much abuse at all. It's got low nerve, so even though it's defense 6 at the front, a couple of wounds plinked on it and you find that it gets wavered. So keeping it behind the lines and then using it for multi-charges or counter-charges when they punch a hole through your lines is the best thing. Because obviously you don't want it taking the first hit, because all its damage is coming in the form of Thunderous Charge. So it needs to get the charge off. So just keeping it behind your lines, because it's not that fast. So the only way to guarantee the charge is to not put it at the front. Just use it to plug the holes and combo charge. So yeah, it can be very, very useful, but it does go down easy sometimes. Drunken Deer, could you leave it on reserve? If you mean actually physically leave it off the table, then no, but you can leave it behind your lines as you're advancing. It is quite tall, though, so the enemy can try and shoot it over the top. If you're just hanging it around behind giants and so on, and then because they don't take up a huge amount of space, you can often multi-charge with giants and with troll bruisers. And with trolls, which again don't have a huge footprint compared to like a goblin horde. So often you will have space for multi-charges to get the mincer in there. Okay, so I'm going to look at Facebook now and cast my eye over the topic I posted up earlier, see if there have been any questions. There were a couple of Kings of War related questions actually on my post in Kings of War Fanatics group. One of them asking, yeah, I think I kind of touched on this, Spitter Horde still good with the loss of almost guaranteed piercing with Bane Chant, and will you just invest in war machines now? Yes, big rock throwers instead of Spitter Hordes, that's what the general consensus is at the moment, I think. Also, I recently tried out the Sharp Stick Thrower on the back of a Slasher, which once you get your mind around how to use it can actually be very potent, because obviously you're shooting the enemy, but then you've got a potential charge distance of 14 inches with it. So it can charge in and actually get to vital positions on the table in the last couple of turns after shooting for the first few turns. So I quite like that. I think it should be a little bit cheaper though, because it's hard to justify putting that in instead of a second giant. So if it was 15 points cheaper, I would be all over the slasher. Drunken Deer, could you wall it off with trolls and release it, or would the area of effect stuff hurt? Not a Kings of War player, obviously. If you're surrounding your mincer, then it's going to be harder to shoot because it'll be in cover. So people probably just wouldn't bother shooting it if it's behind trolls, for example, because the -1 to hit would make it very, very difficult to actually hit it. And it's not that expensive. They'd probably rather shoot at the trolls. If you just leave it in the open, of course, they'll just do a little plink on it, just a tiny little shooting attack, try and do 1 or 2 wounds and maybe waver it. But if you're making them invest a lot of dice, they're probably not going to bother because it's so cheap. But it does hit as hard as a giant if you can get the charge in. So it's more of a finesse unit. You can't just send it straight forwards and expect it to do anything. But move it up with the trolls, yes. Move it up behind the trolls, probably. And if a troll unit dies, you've got the mincer to plug that gap then. Then it can do some serious damage. Matthew James says, just give the Spitter Horde piercing and accept that it now hits on 5s. Yeah, since you can't give them +1 to hit, you can still put the piercing item onto a Spitter Horde. But it makes them quite expensive, and you're not going to get a lot of hits with it. They're not terrible by any means. I just think people are going to move towards War Machines, at least for a while. We'll see if it evens back out again. But obviously there's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction when there's something that's deemed as a nerf to a unit. People immediately just abandon it. And they'll probably gravitate back towards it if it turns out it was a balanced move that they made. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. Okay, let's have a look at my other topic here. Okay, there's a few topics on here. Dino says, Lewd Bowl is always on my list of topics to discuss. Well, as of yet, I have not played any Blood Bowl or Lewd Bowl. Russell Higgins says, not Kings of War player, Drunken Deer, you should be. Yes, you definitely should give it a try. Even if you play other games, it's a pretty simple rule set to get your head around, so it doesn't drain all your mental resources figuring out how to play it. And also, of course, if you already have, like a lot of people do, if you already have old Warhammer armies, then you can quite easily repurpose them for Kings of War without much work at all. And even if you play something like Age of Sigmar, and all your models are on round bases, you can easily buy trays that have the little round holes in them, so you can use those models for multiple game systems as well. Which is something I've thought about doing with my Stormcast Eternals, using them in Kings of War as ogres from time to time. I'll just have to get some bases first to try out. Okay, let's see what else we got. Paul Richardson wanted to know, what are your reasons for choosing goblins as a Kings of War army? Well, I could say that I just loved how they looked, and they just immediately grabbed me. As the first time I saw a goblin starter set, it was like it plucked at one of my heartstrings, and I just longed to see a sea of green and orange in front of me on the table. But the truth is, it was kind of 50-50. I was thinking, goblins are cool, but abyssal dwarves are also really cool. And I already had some abyssal dwarves because of one of the Mantic crazy boxes or crazy bags. I had a big bag just of abyssal dwarves. So I was leaning towards them, and I was at a Mantic Open Day, which I think it was one of the Mantic Open Days where I was like filming the seminars for the Chilling Wargamers channel. I think they're still up on that channel. And me and some of the other Chilling Wargamers people were looking at the armies, and Spud immediately grabbed the Abyssal Dwarf army off the shelf, and that was going to be his choice of army. So I thought, well, that rules out Abyssal Dwarves. Let's have a look. And goblins were up there, above the likes of orcs. I think goblins just look really cool. And generally, when I've played armies, I don't go for massed numbers. So I thought it'll be a bit of a change going for something where there's just a huge tide of just terrible troops. Even though I use quite a few trolls and giants now, so it's not really ended up that way. But there's still a goblin core in there, and spiritually there's a goblin core in there as well. So they were kind of a second choice, but I don't regret going for them at all, because I think they look very, very cool. The trolls and the Fleabag Riders are, I think, some of the best models that Mantic do. right up there with a lot of the undead stuff. The undead zombies are really nice. I like the skeletons a lot. There are some undead models I don't particularly like. I'm not so keen on the werewolves. But as the goblins, apart from the standard plastic goblins, which I'm sure one day they're going to make better plastic goblins, but the current ones are a bit lacking in the detail and the poses are a bit wonky. But all the restic stuff, the flea bags, the trolls, very, very nice. The more beasts are really good, but of course I've used balls for mine. So yeah, I want to see them make some chariots though for goblins. That's the one thing they need to do, because I would like to try out chariots at some point. Okay, where were we? Okay, there's one here from Lee Fellows. Talk about how more companies need to sort out rigorously playtesting their rules and presenting them well in a rulebook without 2 paragraphs of fluff between finding out what something is and what it does. Yes, there are a few games that do that. Games that make it perfectly clear what everything does. Kings of War is at the top of the list, of course. The rules are very, very concise and easy to figure out. Other games that have done a pretty good job of that would include Age of Sigmar. Everything you need for a particular unit is just on one page. There is no, this unit has this special rule, refer to page 87 of this particular book to find out what it actually does. It just tells you everything they do on one page, which I like a lot. With Kings of War, they have very little digging through the rules because there's not that many special rules to remember. And there aren't any that do the same thing but slightly differently worded, like in 40k, where there's just a zillion different rules that do essentially the same thing. And there's rules where the rule has a name, but really it's just combining 2 other existing special rules. Kings of War doesn't have too much of that, so very, very simple. So yes, I would like more war games to just have the rules really easy to follow and the fluff totally separate. Let's see. And also vigorously play tested, so the rules are actually balanced from the off. Well, yes. He says it's like buying into an early access game on PC almost all the time with tabletop. A lot of games, when they're released, they don't seem to have been tested that much because the balance seems to be off. Kings of War seems to be very, very well tested from the off. Obviously, no matter how well you test something, as soon as you get it into the hands of massed player base, then it's going to go a bit crazy and people are going to discover things that you just didn't find out, or there's going to be trends that you didn't expect. Because obviously, however much playtesting you do, you're still only a small sample group, and you're going to be leaning a certain way play style wise. And once people start using it in different ways and pick up different things from the wording, you're going to want to errata things and come out with different versions. But for the most part, Kings of War seems pretty solid in that regard. I would like to see more games have that kind of approach to playtesting, where there is really, you can't poke too many holes in Kings of War. Let's see, any other topics people wanted me to touch on here? Digging through all the various Facebook posts to see if there's anything else. I don't think there's anything that I haven't really touched on already, apart from people asking for Age of Sigmar related topics, which of course can wait until every other Tuesday rather than Friday. Right, so that's that for now. If anyone else has any more questions, drop them in the chat. Darren Parks, are you going to win Fools of War? Yes, I'm very much going to win Fools of War, but I don't even know which army I'm taking to it yet. You see, the thing is, I've taken goblins to a few in a row now, and I want to give the undead another go, especially with these new changes to vampires. I want to see if I can maybe make a few tweaks and keep them at the same high level that I was previously achieving with undead. I did quite well in my 3 tournaments with them, the last 3 I did with the undead. So I'm going to take them to a tournament in a couple of weeks. And if I do well, then maybe I'll take them to Fools of War as well, which is a big 2-day event. Let's see. Drunken Deer, I have an AOS troll army. Could I do a Kings of War troll army? Yes. If you play goblins, you can take tons of trolls. Lots and lots of trolls. If you play in a tournament where they have the rule that you can only take 3 of any particular unit, then you could have 3 troll hordes and 3 troll regiments. You would have to put them on square bases, your trolls, but I'm pretty sure that you could get, if you look into one of the movement tray MDF companies, they could give you a tray that has the little holes, the round holes in them. It depends how big the bases are that your trolls are on at the moment. Ideally, you would want to know that you were going to use them for 2 games from the off, and then maybe you could magnetize them to different bases. Let's see, the Bigfoot. When people say, oh, you're a gamer, get a life. Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever said that to me. Don't hear too much of that. Drunken Deer, yes, I can do the convert thing for tray 40mm. Yes, you can. Russell Higgins, what are you painting? Well, I wanted to be priming today because I've got lots of things just waiting to be primed, but it was raining outside, and I don't trust airbrush priming anymore because it keeps clogging up my airbrush. But I want to be painting this Star Drake for Age of Sigmar. Very, very painfully expensive model. I want to be painting my trolls, my goblins. I don't know if I'll actually use them like this because I want to get 2 more, but these are all the trolls I had left. So I want to get another box of 3, and then I can make 1 more little regiment to go behind to make a horde, and then I can use the final one to make another bruiser, which I'm going to convert. I don't know what I'm going to do with that one yet because my other bruiser is converted with the big kind of spiky ball hands. So I'm going to convert him up real nice and get another bruiser so I can run 3 troll hordes and 2 bruisers, just mincing around with them. And also, from the Leodis Bash tournament, the goodie bag came with a tiny little sprue of 4 zombies. So I've been assembling them today. Let's focus on this one. Okay, you can see there he's actually, if it'll focus on him, you can see that he's feasting on a human head, and he doesn't have any legs, that one. And the other ones aren't particularly interesting, just your standard zombie poses. Nothing too exciting there. Just to have a few more zombies in case I want to run that 3rd Legion at some point. Because I think since I last ran 2, I've painted more ghouls, and ghouls can easily just slot into the zombie units, and they don't look out of place at all. They're a slightly different colour, the way I paint them. But just in among the zombies, you don't really notice a difference, and then I can still use the ghouls as separate units if I wish. Also, the zombie legions, of course, have tons of gravestones just scattered in there. Favourite tournament format? Well, the last tournament I went to was lower point level and more games throughout the day and less time per game. I'm not sure what I prefer. I think I just prefer the standard 2,000 points tournament for Kings of War. I think that's still the mainstay. Do you think Kings of War is picking up in popularity? I would say it probably is. The tournament scene seems to be thriving. It's not dying off like other games have been over the last few years. It seems to be doing well. I haven't heard of any Kings of War tournaments being cancelled due to lack of players, for example, and I've heard that about multiple other game systems. Drunken Deer, I'll make a deal. You play Frostgrave with Rem on YouTube. I'll bring Kings of War army down your neck of the woods. Well, I don't think I'd be able to get Rem to try another game system. So there's a slight issue with that one. The deal you were offering me was like a bag of coins with a hole in, the hole being Mr. Remington's unwillingness to try other game systems. Stu Rat, shouldn't mix ghouls with zombies. Ghouls are living creatures that like to eat the flesh of the dead. Yes, but the Mantic ghouls do look a lot like the Mantic zombies, so no one's really going to notice. And I've mixed and matched parts from zombies and ghouls together. Drunken Deer, he can use halflings. Well, that's going to be a plus, but the ability to use halflings didn't really get him to try out Kings of War multiple times, so I don't know if we'll have much success there. But you never know, maybe if you nag Remington into trying out a new game system, you might have some success. Darren Parks wants to know if Stu Rat is Rat Boy Stew from Sheffield. Apparently he knows someone called Stu who is known as Rat Boy, and he thinks that he may have infiltrated the chat under a slightly altered name. And he says that no, he's in the US. So there are lots of rat stews all over the place, apparently. Hopefully not in restaurants, though, because that sounds foul. Okay, anyone else got anything we're going to touch on before I depart for the evening? It's been quite busy in the chat tonight. We've had a solid number of viewers all the way through. We've had about 25 throughout most of the show, which is pretty damn good. I don't know what I'm going to be talking about on the next edition of this show, probably in 2 weeks. But something will probably jump out at me the day of the show or the day before, like it normally does. And let's see, what have I got planned for this weekend gaming-wise? Well, tomorrow I'm playing a game of Age of Sigmar, tomorrow evening. I've got all my Stormcast Eternals on the table over there, so that's going to be a battle report. And I'm trying to arrange at least one Kings of War game within the next week or 10 days or so. So that's hopefully going to become a battle report as well. So 2 battle reports planned in the immediate future. And let's see, anything else? Anything else I want to talk about from my table of goodness here? Well, I can say that this glue has changed my life when it finally arrived, because I was surviving on using terrible poly cement for ages. I think I already showed this off on video once, but let's just have a look at it again. This is the glue I was using for like 6 months. Look at the consistency of that. Yep, it's not really pouring out at all. You can see it just starting to escape now in a big blob. Very, very stringy, and it's not even retreating into the bottle very fast. Look at that. So I'm glad that that is a thing of the past. I can actually just throw that away now, I think, because its very presence insults me as a model builder. And then this one wasn't much better, which is like the toothpaste of the polystyrene cement world, where it just goes absolutely everywhere. Darren Park says, what's your favorite game system at the moment? That's a very, very tough one. Based on the amount of game time that I'm getting with it, I would say probably Kings of War at the moment. That's the one I've been able to delve into the most recently, because I've been playing it more often than any other system. In terms of purely what is my favorite set of rules out there, then it might still be Bolt Action, possibly, but I haven't played it since version 2 came out. So it might have changed. When I've tried version 2 of Bolt Action, I'll let you know if it's still purely my favorite rule set. And then Sean Blake says Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar is definitely right up there. And it would certainly be right up there next to Kings of War when I'm able to play it. But it's more difficult to get games of Age of Sigmar in. But there are a couple of people around here, and one of them is coming around for a game tomorrow. It's just a lot easier to find games of Kings of War. Drunken Deer, have you ever played against a wargamer who seriously needed deodorant and you almost had to forfeit because of the smell? I've never almost had to forfeit, but I'm sure I've played against plenty of wargamers who could have benefited from deodorant. Some of them probably weren't to blame. Some of them probably were. But in recent times, I can't think of any particularly pungent odors that I experienced, especially at tournaments. The only tournament I can think of that I went to at even remotely recently that had any kind of odor was in a really small room, and that was the only one I can think of where it got a bit hot and steamy in there. Most of the tournament venues seem to be pretty good and airy. That's airy as in air, not as in hairy. I'm sure a lot of the tournament halls are very hairy as well. Let's see. I've been to lots of conventions where the stench has been overpowering. If you go to one of the really big conventions, often they have multiple rooms. And if you go into one of the smaller, more cramped rooms, then often the stench will lay siege to your nostrils with an unrelenting assault. Sean Blake wants to try Kings of War. Good. Give it a go. If you've got any kind of Kings of War presence in your area, then it's a very, very fun, easy, quick game to get into. Skeleton Flower says Malifaux. I've played 2 games of Malifaux ever, and it's pretty good, but I don't really know anyone that plays it in the very close proximity to me. And the rules aren't that easy for Malifaux, from what I recall. And Darren Parks is trying to entice Sean Blake into his welcoming wargaming bosom in the chat right now. always looking to expand the Kings of War community. But unfortunately, he's in Canada, and I don't think even Mr. Darren Parks' wargaming bosom is quite that vast. Drunken Deer, I had to suicide my army in a tournament because the guy smelt of, well, I'm not sure I want to make people vomit by reading that one out. But yeah, I can imagine a tournament, if someone has a particularly powerful stench on the other side of the table, then it would make you want to get the game over with pretty sharpish. Mickey Jennifer says Cheeks is her favourite game, and rightly so. It is, of course, the best-selling card game out there at the moment. And there's a link if you want to buy Cheeks in the description below, along with all the other handy links. Demon_Lizard says, ever played the 9th Age? I haven't, and I probably won't. I think I've left the old world behind, as it were, even the spiritual successor, because I managed to get everything that I need from other game systems now. When 8th edition ended, rather than trying to cling to it, like I was going to say something that sounded really disgusting then. I'm just abandoning that thought. Let's forget the whole clinging thing. So rather than hanging on to 8th edition and trying to relive the past, I found that I've got everything I need from a combination of playing Age of Sigmar and Kings of War. So I haven't felt the need to sample 9th Age at this stage. Who knows? I know there are some people in the chat that are big fans of it, though. I know Skeleton Flower is a big 9th Age fan. Let's see. Anyone else want to get anything off their chest before I depart for the night? Because I've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes, I think, now. It's quite a sizable chunk of high-quality free entertainment for all you people out there. And I'm sure it's been riveting viewing all the way through, especially those of you who know nothing about Kings of War. I'm sure you've made it to this point. Let's see. Drunken Deer, needless to say, didn't shake the hand of his very smelly opponent. Well, if he had maybe a really clean and sweet-smelling hand and just the rest of his body was pure stench, it's entirely possible. Okay, I think we're about ready to wrap this one up now, folks. As much as I would like to talk for the next 4 hours, I will have to sleep at some point tonight. So let's have one last check on Facebook to see if anyone asked any more questions. And Mickey Jenver's final question is, what's going on in the world, or specifically on this show, which I think you've probably been watching since the start? Drunken Deer says, thanks for the painting motivation. I hope lots of people got painting done while this show was going on, because obviously there hasn't been that many visual aids. It's been mainly just my face talking to you while I've been reading things that you can't see. So I'm sure you've enjoyed that very much. People who love staring at a wall of orange. It's not been that bright, though. I could have a light shining right against the backdrop to blind everybody. I can tell when someone's a first-time viewer because they usually comment on how bright the wonderful wall of orange is. Okay, time to say goodnight, I think. So let us have one final look at this beautiful photoshopped image. Years of training myself to use Photoshop have resulted in beautiful pieces of work like this. The ability to crop someone's head and put it onto someone else's body is a really underrated skill in the world, something I've been perfecting since about 2004 when I first downloaded Photoshop. That was the first time I ever cut out someone's head, put it on someone else's body, and laughs were had by all involved. Okay, Mickey Jenver's painting is going wrong, apparently. Although, if you've seen Mickey Jenver's painting, then going wrong probably means that she would only take second place in a Golden Demon, because it is pretty ridiculously good. So I'm sure, compared to my painting going wrong, where it would involve the model catching fire probably, then I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Okay, folks, time to say goodnight out there, whatever you are. And don't forget to look at all the various links in the description, including joining the Facebook group and following me on Twitter and all that nonsense. Good night, everybody.